All right, I think we're ready this morning for Ecclesiastes. We're looking at the 5 books on the roll, Old Testament survey. The name in the Hebrew is Kohelet. Kohelet. And that's from the word in the Hebrew that means church in the New Testament. The kahal is assembly. R-Q-A-H-A-L. It's not from that word, but they're all from the same root. It's from the verb. That's the noun. To assemble would be of the verb, kahal. Sounds just like the noun. But the title in the Hebrew is not Ecclesiastes, but Kohelet. And let me get turned there. You might want to turn there. The words of the preacher. Now that term translated preacher is the word Kohelet. And it's from the word which means to assemble or assembly. And if you can put 2 and 2 together, what's the word for church in the New Testament? Anybody? Anybody? Somebody had Greek then. Ecclesia. See, Ecclesiastes, Ecclesia. So Ecclesiastes means the preacher, or the one who addresses an assembly. And that's taken from the Septuagint, that title. Hebrew title, of course, is not seldom ever the English titles. If you're putting 2 and 2 together, what we're saying is the title in the Hebrew is taken from the first verse, the word translated here, preacher. Martin Luther translated as preacher, and King James Version more or less followed that. But it's from a word which means assembly. In the New Testament, it's taken from this Greek term. See, Ecclesiastes is Greek. That's the Septuagint title. That title comes from the Septuagint, Ecclesiastes, which is the Greek form of one who addresses an assembly. The word for church in the New Testament is assembly. Not church, of course. That's a German word, but what's often called church is assembly, like faith assembly. We're not faith church, but we're faith assembly. Jesus said, upon this rock I'll build my assembly, not church. Because church means the building. Well, we're saying more than we need to say about this, but that's where the title comes from. The first verse, translated preacher. Preacher is probably the best translation. Should be called, not the book of Ecclesiastes, but the preacher. Kohelet, if you speak Hebrew. Who's the author, secondly? Well, traditionally, Solomon. In verse 1, he speaks of himself, whoever this is, as the son of David. The words of Kohelet, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Well, certainly Solomon was David's son and king in Jerusalem. And in verse 16, I communed with my own heart, saying, Lo, I am come to great estate. I have gotten more wisdom than all they that have been before me in Jerusalem. Yea, my heart had great experience of wisdom and knowledge. Well, who was the wisest man that ever lived besides Jesus? Solomon. So, on the basis of internal evidence, though the book does not say by Solomon, traditionally it is Solomon is the author, for the obvious reasons. Now the key verse, the key idea, key word in the book, there's one word that characterizes Ecclesiastes. Now I assume that you are keeping up with your reading and trying to anticipate where we're going to be studying next. If you're not, why, don't let me know it. I've said it enough, haven't I? What's the key idea or word in the book? Vanity. What's vanity mean? A mirror with a dresser under it? That has a good name to it, doesn't it? Vanity, because people are always primping themselves or vain. What's that? There's a cosmetic that means something like that. What is it? Oh, no, it's the... Well, we won't go into that. This goes over the air. Somebody will be suing us for something that isn't even important, or trying to, or thinking about it. Vanity means emptiness, uselessness, worthlessness. Vanity, that's a good King James translation of the Hebrew word, which means emptiness, nothingness, worthlessness, uselessness, and such like. That's the key word. Occurs throughout the book. Like in 1:14, I have seen all the works that are done under the sun, and behold, all is emptiness, vanity. He's seen everything man's done, it's vanity. It's just worthless. 2:11, then I looked on all the works that my hands had wrought, and on the labor that I had labored to do, and behold, all was vanity and vexation of spirit, and there was no profit under the sun. All is vanity is the theme. 3:17, I said in mine heart, God shall judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time for every purpose, for every work. Now, obviously, that isn't the verse. I want 19. For that which befalleth the sons of men befalleth beasts. Even one thing befalleth them, as one dieth, so dieth the other. Yea, they have all one breath, so that a man hath no preeminence above a beast. For all is vanity. All is uselessness, meaninglessness, emptiness, what he said. 4:16. All through the book the theme occurs. 4:16 and so on. The word vanity, word translated vanity, occurs over 37 times in these 12 chapters. So this is where we get the idea that that's the theme. And it's pretty repetitious after you hear it 37 times in 12 chapters. Of course, you ought to read a book like this at one sitting when you're studying for a course, and then you get the whole idea in mind. The theme of the book, though, is a little more encouraging than that, or it wouldn't be in the Bible. The theme is this: the author seeks the highest good in life. That's our question in ethics, isn't it? The author seeks the highest good in life. And he finds that life is vanity, with the meaning we've given it, of course. Life is vanity without meaning, apart from God. Life is vanity without meaning or purpose apart from God. So it does come to a good end. Look at chapter 1, verses 2 and 3. Or put in your notes 1, 2, and 3 with 12, 13, and 14. 1, 2, and 3. Chapter 1, verses 2 and 3 with 12, verses 13 and 14. He says, because of the savor, well, that's Song of Solomon. I'm really with it this morning. I went to bed at 2. It's all right. I know where I'm at. That's better than reading out a Song of Solomon thinking you're in Ecclesiastes. I spotted the difference right away. All right. 1, 2, and 3. Vanity of vanities, saith the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What profit has a man of all his labor which he taketh under the sun? And he proceeds to run through the whole book with that theme, but his conclusion of the matter is quite different. Ecclesiastes 12, 13, and 14. So let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. You see, after all is vanity all through the book, what is the conclusion? Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God shall bring every work into judgment, and every secret thing, whether it be good or whether it be evil. So he's saying, live righteously. Fear God and keep his commandments. That's what Solomon, who had tried everything, 1,000 wives, richest man in the world, had everything his heart desired. Everything. Nothing. In a material way, and the wisest man who ever lived, he knew everything that he needed to know in his day. In fact, he knew everything he needed to know. And he tried everything, and that's his conclusion. Well, I've tried everything. Everything's vanity. So I would recommend, he says, to you that you fear God and keep his commandments. The outline of the book, the prologue, the vanity of all things, chapter 1, verses 1 to 11. The vanity of all things, chapter 1, verses 1 to 11. Two, the evidence of the vanity of all things. 1:12 through chapter 6:12. He gives the evidence. Now, this is one of the books we study in detail when we study poetical literature, but he shows the vanity of wisdom, the vanity of folly, the vanity of pleasure, the vanity of labor, the vanity of possessions, the vanity of wealth, the vanity of entertainment. All is vanity. Then the third division, conclusions and admonitions, based upon these experiences and observations. He gives the evidence of the vanity of all things in the second division. Third division, conclusions and admonitions, based upon these experiences and observations. Chapter 7 through chapter 12, verse 8. Then the epilogue, the solution to all things. The solution to all things, chapter 12, verses 9 to 14. Now there's a lot of interesting study in the book of Ecclesiastes. Like in chapter 12, that chapter is often used at funerals. And it will come as a real enlightenment to most of you what chapter 12 has to say about the nature of man. Life and death, and the description there of him losing his teeth and getting old and so on, and it's quite interesting. And then there's a charge to the youth, often used by preachers in sermons to the youth. Remember the days of thy Creator and the days of thy youth. Speaks of the silver cord in verse 6 of chapter 12. What's the silver cord? Well, anyone who's done any study in spiritual realms knows there is a silver cord. Spiritualists and people who go into trances see it many times, for example. Not that others haven't seen it who are not into occult, but it occurs much in occult writings. As long as the silver cord isn't broken, there's still life in the body, though the person may be in a coma. But there is actually a cord connecting between the physical life on this earth and spiritual life, and when that's severed, death occurs, and that cord is seen. Well, that's biblical. It has been seen many times. That's biblical. It's Ecclesiastes 12:6. Not that it's made out of silver. It of course is some sort of spiritual substance that you can see in the spirit realm. Remember, Paul says the resurrection body is a body. Jesus said, I'm not a spirit. I have flesh and bones in his resurrected body. All right, Esther is the last book on the roll. Esther. Last book on the Megillot, or the scroll or roll. Well, you're looking for it, I can tell. Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther. It comes before Job. You tell that we don't get too much in these books when you have to hunt for them. Esther. The last book on the roll. These 5 were on a roll because of their use. They were used at feast days. This one is used at the Feast of Purim, Purim. Ruth was a harvest song, and Lamentations on a day of fasting. All right, Esther. The Hebrew name is not Esther, and the name, if you want to turn there first, is given in chapter 2, verse 7. Her Hebrew name is Hadassah. And he brought up Hadassah, that is Esther. Esther is her Persian name. Esther. Well, you know how to spell it in English, so I don't have to transliterate that. Hadassah means myrtle. So her name's Myrtle in Hebrew. Myrtle, Myrtle. So people who are called Myrtle have a Hebrew name. Her name in Persian, you want to know what Esther means? You got a marginal reference? It means star. Star. The author who wrote it? Well, by Jewish tradition, the men of the great synagogue. I don't know if we've mentioned the great synagogue. It's always spelled with capital letters. The great synagogue, of which Ezra, the scribe, headed it. And they were, by Jewish traditions, the one who put the Old Testament together. Collected some of the Psalms and so forth, putting them together in a book. We have the book of Psalms. The great synagogue by the Jewish tradition wrote Esther. Josephus says Mordecai is the author. And there's no reason to think that he isn't, so I stick with Mordecai being the author. The internal evidence seems to indicate that anyway, that he did the writing, because it says more than once that he wrote things, so all probability did. The date of this book, the date of Esther, we can date it about 478 BC. That's when she becomes Queen of Persia. 478 BC. So this is a 5th century BC book. Back, remember, the Jews had been taken to Babylon, 586 BC. They spent 70 years in captivity. 536, a group came back under Zerubbabel. And Zechariah became the prophet, and Zechariah and Haggai. And then later, about a century later, Ezra and Nehemiah lead 2 returns back. And in between the first return in 536 and Ezra Nehemiah, the books of Ezra Nehemiah, Esther comes. That's her date in between then. And by the time she's on the scene, Babylon has fallen and Persia has conquered the world. So that's why she's queen of Persia. Like verse 1, it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus. This is Ahasuerus who reigned from India even to Ethiopia, over 120 provinces. And his kingdom was in Shushan, which of course is Persia. The 3rd year of his reign, he made a feast unto all his servants, the power of Persia and Media. Of course, the kingdom was twofold, as we've mentioned in other connections. It's a Medo-Persian kingdom, but Persia is the dominant side of the kingdom. And then Daniel, under his ministry as prophet, we have Darius the Mede, but we're still in the Medo-Persian period. But Esther comes after the fall of Babylon, the conquering of the world by Persia. So her husband is Ahasuerus, or in Greek, you'll see it in your literature, Xerxes. If you ever see that name, and you will constantly in reading about Old Testament history, Xerxes. Not X, well, you can't pronounce it with an X. Anyway, it's Z, Xerxes. This is Ahasuerus. Another reason why we can date so accurately a lot of these things in the Old Testament, because we know the reign of the kings under other names in history. So Esther is about 478 BC. Now, you can always look at your chart that we had you by. If you don't remember it, you can fit all these things in by looking at that. What's the purpose of the book of Esther? Now, some of these books we won't study in poetical literature. So, if you have any questions, you have to do your own independent study, or ask your questions here and we'll try to answer them. But this is not one of them that we study in poetical literature. So what we say will be all we'll deal with it, unless sometime we teach the whole book for some reason. Generally, it's a book taught in Sunday school, because it's a story, historical account, but a story that you can read and teach in one sitting. The purpose of the book, to show God's providential preservation of Israel in Persia, in the Persian period, we should say, to show God's providential preservation of Israel in the Persian period. Of course, Persia was the whole world at that time, the known world, because we read there that this king Ahasuerus ruled all the way from Ethiopia. See, now he's got Africa, Egypt, to India. That takes you over to China, to the bordering China. So he ruled the world of that day. And Jews were scattered all over the known world. And the purpose of the book is to show how God preserved his people. Its importance is to be seen. This book is showing us how that Israel was threatened with complete annihilation, because the order went out, and a decree that went out by the Medes and Persians was never changed. Once the decree was given, that was it. And this shows how God, and the decree that went out was to annihilate every Jew in every province throughout the empire. And God providentially, through Esther, preserved his people, or else there'd be no Jewish race. It was a greater threat than Hitler against the Israelites. So it was the devil's attempt to annihilate the Hebrew race, and thus the Messiah and the kingdom and everything else. Shows how God preserved that. Secondly, it shows the origin of the Feast of Purim, which is still celebrated to this day. The origin of the Feast of Purim. Now you have to know the story of the book, and as I've said so many times, you should know that from Sunday school, but just in case you don't know, Israel is in captivity, Babylonian captivity. Nebuchadnezzar conquers, of course, Palestine, the Jewish nation, destroyed, carried into captivity. Babylon goes off the scene, conquered by the Medes and Persians. The queen of Persia, Ahasuerus' wife, or Xerxes' wife, he was such a powerful and rich king, he gave a feast that lasted for months. And the concluding feast, he sent word to have his wife come because she was so beautiful. He was going to show her off to all of his princes and nobles from all over the empire who were gathered there. And she had gotten some teaching from Women's Lib and decided she wasn't coming. That's right. And so it angered the king quite a bit, to say the least, because in those days women didn't even answer their husbands back, didn't even raise a question. And of course he asked the council of his nobles and princes. They said, well, if you let her get away from this, then all the women throughout the empire will rebel, if the most powerful queen in the world. And so this is what you shall do: depose her and get another queen, which is what he did. He put her aside for her little bit of rebellion. She lost everything. And for, I think, a year, they selected the most beautiful women in Persia, and Esther happened to be an extremely beautiful virgin. And for about a year, they prepared them, took baths every day in milk and oil, and, really got ready for presentation to the king, and he would select a queen. Now, if you've been to Sunday school, you know this, but you have to see what the Feast of Purim's all about. You may have forgotten that. And to make a long story short, naturally Esther got the nod. Then Haman, for reasons the book shows, got elevated to second in the empire. Haman. Old Haman. He's the villain in the plot. And everybody bowed to him and did obeisance, except Mordecai, because Esther became queen. By the way, Esther was Mordecai's niece, if I remember right. That's close enough anyway. And he raised her after the parents had died. And so he sat in the gate of the king because of his concern for Esther. And since Mordecai didn't bow to the king, he bowed, obviously, as we'll see later, he bowed only to God. That's what's implied. It was told Haman, and he was so wroth, he found out he was a Jew, and he got the king, didn't tell him why, but got him, said the Jews are troublous people all over the empire. The same thing's always been said about them. And I think it'd be good if the king would annihilate this people. And of course the king, not knowing Esther was a Jew, she kept that secret, decreed it. Once a Persian king decreed it, became the law of the Medes and Persians and could not be changed. And so Haman built a gallows to hang Mordecai publicly, and then sent word throughout the empire on a certain day for everybody in the empire to gather together and slay all the Jews in their community. They were going to annihilate them. Well, you see, this is a real threat against all of the prophecy about Messiah and Israel being restored and everything. So it's no unimportant book. And when Mordecai learns of the plot, he has Esther intercede by fasting and prayer for 3 days, and then asks audience of the king. Now, you could never go before the king, even his wife. It means death without any hesitation. That's another law of the Medes and Persians. Unless he held out his scepter. And so she didn't know whether she'd lose her head or not. And so after 3 days of fasting and prayer, she went before the king, and naturally, as the story goes, he allowed her to come to the throne, and told, again, to make a long story short, had a feast, and she exposes Haman's plot. Then the king learns that Esther is a Jew. That means she would have to die too, and all of her people. So the king can't change the law of the Medes and Persians, but he can decree something else that the Jews can defend themselves. So it goes forth another law. And on that day they did defend themselves, and very few, if any, Jews were killed throughout the empire. Haman is hung on the gallows made for Mordecai, and Haman, before he asked the king to issue this decree to slay the Jews, they cast lots, and that's called pur in Hebrew. That's where the Purim comes from. Pur, and the plural is im, as you Hebrew students know. So the feast then, after the successful outcome of the whole thing, the feast that was instituted and is still celebrated today, the deliverance of Israel out of the hands of their enemies, it's called the Feast of Purim, comes from this term, casting of lots. All right, everybody sufficiently enlightened. Now that is set forth in chapter 3, verse 7, and chapter 9, verses 21 to 26, the meaning of the feast. Chapter 3, verse 7, of course this is occult, the way Haman determines the most propitious time to seek the mind of the king. In the first month, that is the month Nisan, in the 12th year of the king Ahasuerus, they cast pur. See, there's your word. That is the lot before Haman from day to day and from month to month until they came to the 12th month. That just happened to be the month that it would be best to approach the king. They didn't rush into these things. They were superstitious, and, they're seeking counsel of the stars and the astrologers and casting lots. Then in chapter 9 it speaks of it, this feast. Because Haman, verse 24, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had devised against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast pur, that is the lot, to consume them. Then verse 26, they called these days Purim, after the name of Pur. So that's what the book of Esther is all about, to show how God providentially preserved his people and the origin of the Feast of Purim. Now the Jews know the story. It'd be good if Christians do, because Christianity came right out of the Old Testament, as we've shown you time and again. There's one, I don't like to call it problem, but that's for want of a better term. There's only one problem to be discussed with the book. Problem in the sense that it poses a problem to some people, and that is, well, who knows what it is? What is unique about this book that is unlike any book in the Old Testament? See, somebody's been studying. It doesn't mention the name of God. And so some say, well, it isn't inspired, or how did it get in the canon, and so forth. So there is no mention of God in the book. But we can say the book was admitted to the Jewish canon, and if there's one thing for certain, no book ever got in the Hebrew canon they didn't consider inspired. They were quite careful of that. There were books that come close to, well, like the books of Maccabees, for example. Some books are, some think should have been admitted. I mean, some people who debate the point, that mention God. So it got admitted to the canon, which shows definitely that it was inspired. We know it was, or it wouldn't have been in there. Of course, the Jews thought it was. Secondly, it does have reference to the providence of God in 4:14. Definite reference to the providence of God in 4:14. And then the Jewish religious rite of fasting is mentioned in 4:16 and in 9:31. Now, of course, other nations could fast, but it certainly was peculiar to the Hebrews. That was incorporated right in their law, the rite of fasting, religious rite of fasting, 4:16 and 9:31. Prayer is certainly mentioned in 9:31. Again, the central place that the Feast of Purim has played throughout Israelite history, even till today, certainly would testify to its divine institution. It was central in Israel's religious celebrations. Why no mention of God's name in the book? Well, it's been suggested, and probably rightly so, that the book was copied from Persian historical records. And it's simply that, and maybe this would explain it. Because again and again in the book we have reference to this, what's happening here in this book, being recorded in the Persian Chronicles, like in chapter 2, verse 23. 2:23. And when inquisition was made of the matter, it was found out. Therefore they were both hanged on a tree, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles before the king. And it's mentioned in 9:20, in chapter 10, verse 2, and so on. The acts of his power and of his might, and the declaration of the greatness of Mordecai, whereunto the king advanced him, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of the Media and Persia? So some believe that that may explain it, that it's simply an account of the Persian account of it, and we have again and again stated that what was happening here was written in the Chronicles of the Medes and Persians. And that's a possible answer. Of course, when you stop to think about it, there is certainly by implication a lot of reference to God and his providence and so on, but the Jews, as I said, would never have accepted it otherwise. Now you have a similar case in Daniel. You've got a whole big section that's lifted out of, in fact, it's in another language. It's in Aramaic. Chapter 2 through about chapter 7 is in Aramaic in Daniel. You start out in Hebrew, you go into Aramaic, which is the language of the empire, and then you come back into Hebrew, starting with about chapter 8, roughly. So that would be, that part of it would be a part of the Chronicles, see, written in the Chronicles of Babylon. The outline of the book, Esther's crowned queen, chapters 1 and 2. Esther, crowned queen, chapters 1 and 2. Now, outlines are given so that when you study this in the future, as you study the Bible, then you follow an outline, you know what it's talking about and where you are. It's not just an arbitrary thing. Esther, crowned queen. Secondly, Haman's plot against Mordecai, chapters 3 to 6. Thirdly, Haman's defeat and the Jews' deliverance, chapters 7 to 9. Haman's defeat and the Jews' deliverance, chapters 7 to 9. And Mordecai's greatness, chapter 10. Well, that's just a brief summary, but that's all the course intends to be, a summary of the Old Testament. Now we come to the last division of the Old Testament. Well, we're in the last division, of course, but the last division of the last division. I've got an outline here somewhere. Okay, I used to give these out last time I taught Old Testament survey. Let you know where you are. Now we're coming to the historical books, all right? We're under section 3, the writings. We looked at the poetical books, then what's called the roll with its 5 books. Now the historical books, that's Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, 1 and 2 Chronicles. Daniel, the prophet, what's he doing back here? We had a threefold outline. The Jews divided the canon into 3 parts: the law, the prophets, and the writings. Daniel is in the writings, not the prophets. Well, let's give you the meaning of his name, and then we'll answer that question. Daniel means God is my judge. Daniel. Of course, El is the word for God, and the rest of it means God. And the E is the pronoun my. All Hebrew students who studied Hebrew here remember all that, don't you? Dan, E-El. My judge is God. Yeah.
Is that how everybody would have addressed it? Hello, God is my judge.
Well, they just say Daniel, and then they knew what that meant. Like if you called a man, his name was Miller, you see, you don't stop and think, well, now Miller means a man who grinds grain in a mill, but that's where the name came from. You get to the place where you just say Miller. And every Hebrew name had a meaning, you see, as we've said so many times. Samuel, as soon as you get that Ale on the back, it means something God. Jeremiah, Yah is from Yahweh, meaning God. So all Hebrew names meant something. Ezekiel, see, there's Ale again. But they didn't stop and think, well, now that means so-and-so, but if they stopped and thought, they knew what it meant, of course. Follow what I'm saying? And a lot of names, like Carpenter, people are named Carpenter, but you don't think of a carpenter, you just say, Mr. Carpenter. Stop and think, Carpenter, yeah, I know where you got that name, or what it means. All right, the question we raised, why is Daniel placed among the writings in the Hebrew Bible and among the prophets in the English Bible? The English Bible has nothing to do with the Hebrew as far as the arrangement of books, very obviously. They should have left it the way it was. It was much better, but that's another story. Well, why is Daniel, who is a prophet, among the writings not the prophets? Because of the unique nature of his ministry. Daniel, while he has the prophetic gift and is a prophet, nevertheless appears on the scene of Jewish history in a very unique position. Like that of Joseph, he is a statesman in the Babylonian court. He's an official of the empire. He's second in command, in fact, like Joseph in Egypt many, many centuries before. So he appears as a statesman. And the twofold function of the prophet that we've given you in other studies is that he was a preacher of righteousness to his own generation, and prophesied in that sense of preaching his prophecies, and then he predicted. A prophet has the predictive gift too. And so Daniel, because of his unique position as a statesman at the Babylonian court, of course representing his God at the same time. That's how he ended up in the lion's den. Remember, he never compromised his convictions. But because of his unique position, his prophetic ministry is limited to prediction and interpretation. Prediction. And since he plays an important role in Hebrew history, then it's included under the historical books and the writings. If you notice chapter 1, the book of Daniel opens differently than any prophetic book opens. The prophets always say, the word of the Lord came to me, the vision which Isaiah the prophet, son of Amos, saw. But Daniel just starts out as a mere historical introduction. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, to Jerusalem. And as we see, he conquered the city, he carried away captives. And then in verse 3, the king spake unto Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel of the king's seed, royal seed. Daniel was of royal blood. And princes, children whom was no blemish, well-favored, skillful in all wisdom, cunning in knowledge, understanding science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and tongue of the Chaldeans, that is, the Babylonians. And so that's what happened. Verse 6, we see Daniel was named among his 3 friends as one chosen. Of course, there were many chosen, but Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, the three who went into the fiery furnace, remember. These are the 3. Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. And of course, as you know, the story goes, they prepared him for a certain time, eating certain foods in preparation to present them to the king, Daniel being one of them. At the end of the days, verse 18, that the king had said he should bring them in. They brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel and his 3 friends. They stood before the king, and in all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in his realm. These 4 men remained faithful to God, these young men, and they were greater than all of the wisdom of the magicians and astrologers. And Daniel continued even to the 1st year of Cyrus. Now, he has the longest prophetic ministry in the Bible. See, he's taken captive when Jerusalem falls. He's a young lad here. And he's praying at the end of 70 years in chapter 9, God, when are you going to restore Israel as according to the word of the prophet Jeremiah, that they would be in captivity 70 years. So you can see how long his ministry is in this book. Well, his ministry is probably longer than the book. But as you find, his book opens differently from the prophets, and of course the Jews recognize that he was a prophet, but that he had a ministry that his book fit better in the writings or the historical books. Now, as you would expect, the critics really play havoc with Daniel. If there's one thing the critics agree on, Daniel didn't write Daniel. That's the only thing they agree on, because they've got as many opinions, all contrary to what you believe. This is one place they all agree, that Daniel was written by an unknown author during the Maccabean period, about 167 BC. Written by an anonymous author, 167 BC, the Maccabean period when the Maccabees lived and the books of Maccabees were written. This is a time of great persecution of the Jews under Antiochus Epiphanes, and allegedly, and I was taught this in the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary at Louisville, Kentucky. In case any good old Southern Baptists hear these tapes, they can find out what's being taught there. I was taught this theory erroneous theory I'm giving you now, that during this period of bloody persecution, the Jews, because they would not conform to the wishes of their Greek overlords, who tried to Hellenize Palestine, that is, to make it secular, the Jewish nation, bloody persecution. So this book was allegedly written to encourage the Jews to hold fast to their faith, because eventually they would be delivered. And so certain parables are included in the book to show their deliverance. The parable, get it, of Daniel in the lion's den. The parable of the 3 young men in the fiery furnace. They got delivered, you see, so they were encouraged to hold out. Now they can't deny and don't really deny, most of them at least, the historicity of Daniel the prophet. They believe there was a Daniel. They concede us that much. But that he didn't write the book. That this anonymous author took the character of Daniel and built the story of the book of Daniel around this historical figure to encourage the Jews. Well, we just have one word when we study the major prophets in detail. We'll go into more detail, but and I've got a lot of detail in my book, Old Testament Prophets, but for now, for the Christian, this should settle the matter that Jesus Christ called Daniel the prophet and quoted one of these prophecies right out of the middle of his book to prove that certain end-time events would occur. That's in Matthew 24:15. And it's in reference to his own return. So that should settle the matter for the Christian. That Christ believed not only in the historicity of the prophet, but in his book. He quotes from the book, chapter 9. Quotes right out of Daniel's 70 weeks prophecy, the prophecy of 70 weeks. When you shall see the abomination of desolation, standing in the holy place, of which Daniel the prophet spoke, let him that readeth understand. Readeth what? Readeth the book of Daniel. Well, we'll date the book at 605 BC. 605 BC. Now, of course, it wasn't written in 605. That's when Daniel went into captivity. But you recall when we started out dating Old Testament books, we said we date them at the approximate beginning of a prophet's ministry. But you got to settle somewhere on a date, and that's the best way to do it. The outline of the book will show the purpose of the book. So the purpose, instead of giving it to you, I'll just give you the outline that will show the purpose. Introduction, historical introduction, chapter 1. Secondly, historical. Now this is pretty long, so you want to write it all since it's giving you the purpose of the book too. Second division, historical events from Nebuchadnezzar to Darius. Historical events from Nebuchadnezzar to Darius. Concerning the succession and overthrow of the Gentile world kingdoms and establishment of the kingdom of God. That's chapters 2 through 7. Historical events from King Nebuchadnezzar to Darius concerning the succession and overthrow of the Gentile world kingdoms and establishment of the kingdom of God. Chapters 2 to 7. That's what the dream of Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel's vision and so forth have reference to. How God will, it shows the rise and succession of the various kingdoms of the world and the final establishment of the kingdom of God and the overthrow of those kingdoms. Third division, prophetic visions. Concerning Israel in relation to the Gentile kingdoms until the end times. Prophetic visions concerning Israel in relation to the Gentile kingdoms until the end times. Chapters 8 to 12. So you have a threefold division of the book. Really what the book's all about after that historical introduction, it's showing the rise of Babylon. Remember the image, the head of gold, the breast and arms of silver, the belly and thighs of brass, the irons of leg, the feet of 10 toes mixed with iron and clay. And then Daniel just goes right down the line and identifies them. He said, this is Babylon. And then he sees out in the future Greece and so forth. Medo-Persia, Greece. So the book is really showing the rise and succession of all the Gentile kingdoms. And the last one is Rome, which was to extend to the end time. The Roman kingdom, as we've shown you in other studies of end time events, still continues till today. It was the last, so it's geographically it's still in existence. And it was to extend until the establishment of the kingdom of God on earth, in a literal sense, and the overthrow of the Gentile kingdoms. And so after showing the succession of the kingdoms, this stone that was cut without hands came out of the mountain and grew in size until it covered the whole earth and crushed those other kingdoms, and they were blown away in dust. And it was established and spread throughout the earth, and it was God's kingdom. So that's what the book is, the message of the book. Of course, there's much teaching about resurrection, judgment, Son of Man, Messiah, persecution of Jews, and so on. There are two important things in the book I want you to have in your notes. The vision, the dream in chapter 2 and the vision in chapter 7, which are talking about the same event. In fact, what I just described to you, what was in your outline. You have this dream and the prophecy concerning the rise and fall of the Gentile kingdoms and establishment of the kingdom of God. These two chapters deal with what's called the times of the Gentiles. Times of the Gentiles. That's from the rise of Nebuchadnezzar, the most powerful king, most sovereign king who ever lived, from his rise until Jesus. Remember, Jesus said in Luke 21 that Jerusalem be trodden down by her enemies, trodden down by the Gentiles till the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. Well, Daniel speaks of the times of the Gentiles. And that happened in 1967 when the times of the Gentiles ended. But see, like all prophecy, people who don't know the whole word get off and say, well, see, nothing happened. Times the Gentiles ended, where's Jesus? But see, God doesn't always just specifically say the day or hour when a thing ends. It's like a battle. When the Allies overcame the enemy, the war was over, but there were still battles taking place. Many times, even after our armistice, or at least after they agreed to stop, many people are still killed because of skirmishes and so forth. Or, as Jesus overcame Satan at the cross, but Satan's still the god of this world, according to Scripture, and very active. So his overthrow has happened, but the climax of it will come at the second advent. Chapter 2 and chapter 7 speak of the same events. In chapter 2 you have Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the great image. You know, the image of the colossal figure of a man, head of gold, In chapter 7, you have Daniel's vision of 4 beasts. But they're talking about the same thing, the rise, succession, and fall of the Gentile kingdoms, establishment of the kingdom of God. All right, now, the reason I want you to have this, because it becomes confusing a lot of times to people not knowing how to relate the main emphasis in the book. So the head of gold in chapter 2, if you put 2 columns, put a column chapter 2 and a column chapter 7, and over here, head of gold, see? Head of gold under chapter 2, that's the dream, is the lion with eagle's wings in chapter 7. Which we're told is Babylon in your 3rd column, which I didn't tell you to make. You should have left room for it. Well, yeah, however you want to put it. But you've got chapter 2, chapter 7, and then the identification would be in a 3rd column. But any way you want to do it. The breast and arms of silver in chapter 2 is the bear raised up on one side in chapter 7. Now that's important. Remember, he's raised up on one side because you've got a dual kingdom following Babylon. And that is the Medo-Persian kingdom. M-E-D-O, Medo-Persian kingdom. Medo standing for Media, the kingdom of Media. And of course, the kings of the Medes and Persians reigned over the world together, but Persia was the dominant kingdom, and that's why you see the bear in chapter 7 raised up on one side. That's Persia. She's dominant. But it was one bear, you see. Then the belly and thighs of brass in chapter 2, in the colossal image of the man, the belly and thighs of brass become the leopard with 4 wings and 4 heads in chapter 7. That's Greece. You don't have to worry about who they are because you're told. Right in the book. We're not guessing. Legs other than Rome, but anyone knows that Rome, the iron stands for Rome for a lot of reasons, but anyway, the legs of iron in chapter 2 become the 4th beast with iron teeth in chapter 7, which is Rome. Then the feet and 10 toes of iron and clay. Feet and 10 toes of iron and clay in chapter 2 are the 10 horns of the 4th beast in chapter 7. And that's the final stage of the 4th kingdom, or the Roman kingdom, in the latter days. Because we're told those 10 horns stand for 10 kings, and they'll reign in the latter days. And out of the 10 horns comes a little horn, that'll be Antichrist. And then, then we don't have this in chapter 2, but in chapter 7 you have the little horn, who's Antichrist. We're given more detail in chapter 7. And so the little horn will arise, and that's Antichrist. Then, finally, the stone cut without hands, filling the earth. Chapter 2. Stone cut without hands, filling the earth, chapter 2, is the Son of Man in chapter 7. And of course, that's the kingdom of God and His Messiah.